welcome to the 2 Month Review. This is Chad Post. I'm here with Lytton Smith, our guest on this season's season of the 2 Month Review, in which we're reading Tómas Jónsson Bestseller by Gudbjörg Bergson, slowly but surely over a 2-month period, talking about it, trying to explain some of the context, some of the intricacies of the wordplay, all the different fun. And this week we're joined by David Smith. So all the Smiths are on. David is a librarian, translator from the Norwegian, and a former intern at Open Letter. So anything you want to add to that?
Not really. Glad to be here from Atlanta.
Yeah, from the ATL.
From the ATL, yeah.
But you read this. How did you? So you came to this book over the summer when you were interning here, correct?
I did, yeah. I knew nothing about it. Well, actually, I was told about it a couple years ago when I met Kaya at AWP. She said you had this book in the works that was like the Icelandic Ulysses. And I remembered that for all these 2 years. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to read it right when I got to the internship in Rochester this summer. So
you finished the entire book, right?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so try and keep our spoilers to a minimum, because this is a book that, is super plot driven. Gotta
totally.
Don't want to give away the climax. Don't none of that kind of stuff.
Where was the climax again?
I think that's coming soon.
Okay.
Bad joke. But what did you think of it overall?
I absolutely loved it. I read through it once, and I'm midway through my second reading of it right now, and there's just so much there. It's one of those books like Ulysses that you're never going to be completely done reading, I think. So it's enough for a lifetime of reading. So I've really enjoyed it.
That's awesome. That's cool that you read it twice, or that you're already in your second time of it too. Which makes sense, because reading it one time is like an enjoyable experience, but also like a bit baffling. And I think
totally.
I think for this too, like one of the things we've run into in doing the recording is like the more that you read ahead, the more it reframes what's come before. In a way that like some books do. I mean, most books probably do that to some degree, but like, and this is like incredibly important, because there's so much stuff that either gets referenced later or gets sort of like, even like the tone. One thing I want to talk about in a second is like whether or not something's ironic or how to treat certain things. You kind of can't even determine that until you see what happens later.
Yeah. So many of the characters, too, become clearer on the second reading, whereas it was really hard to keep straight the first time, I think. So
I feel like there's a sense in which the book is itself, it's a revisionist project. And so, you need to reread it, and you kind of hope that somebody's going to put the book down and then pick it up again, or stay with it over a period of years, even though that's obviously, a big ask for this challenging book.
Yeah. Absolutely. The thing, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add before we just dive into some parts of this, but there's one specific thing that I want to talk about, because we just, last week we talked to Idra Novi, and she brought up, and we had a longer discussion about one of the bits from the previous section, in which it has the paragraph which says immoral conduct with young girl. Now, let's read the whole thing, because I think this is an interesting way of how this book works. So, immoral conduct with young girl. Last night, a man, this is in italics in the middle of like one of his bits, where he says like, you don't want to get mixed up in an arrest from the police. You don't want to be scandalized. You have terrible dreams, like from the pages of a newspaper. And this is immoral conduct with young girl. Last night, a man in his 90s was found guilty of indecent behavior with a 10-year-old girl. It does not appear to have been a direct attempt at sexual relations, and the little girl was absolutely okay, except for nosebleeds and a nervous breakdown and talking in a foreign language. She was taken for medical tests. Her attacker has never been found guilty of similar conduct. The case is still under investigation, which is like, came up as like in the way that it's disturbing, and like what the intent of that is and how to deal with it. Then like 40 pages later, we get this part, which is a bit longer, but which y'all will appreciate, I hope, and find funny, on page 213, when it says, when people walk along the sidewalk, I see they focus their sight sideways into the window with pursed lips and fluttering eyes, always spying on me, especially after the event in the laundry room, which is immediate like red flag of what event in the laundry room? I was simply straddle-footed so I could piss down the drain. I was coming home when I was seized by a sudden urge to pass water there just one time at 8 in the evening. I had never used a laundry myself, which I had equal right to, the same as any other apartment owner. I stood astride the grill and spurted and tried to spurt straight down the holes when the foolish girl came in on me and made me jerk, roar like I had been startled, so I spun around and some of the stream swung into her, causing her to emit a shrill cry and leap to the side of the washing tub screeching, where she crashed into the mangle and fell with a great tumult and lay on the floor among the pots. I rushed to her aid in the dark, and it never rains but it pours, because Valgador came in just then, arms full of dirty laundry that she was going to soak, and screams like her life has been threatened. "What the hell are you doing with the child?" I struggled, bent over the girl, crushed between the tub and the wall, covered with blood from her nose. And when I straightened my back, thunderstruck by astonishment over this new affront, she pointed screaming at my open flap. Bowie, which is his name for his penis, which was referenced before and not explained. Bowie was out his hole, dangling carelessly over the bloody girl. She screams, "What is the meaning of this?" And she brandishes a laundry paddle, threatening at Bowie and I. So all of a sudden, like, that little paragraph that was like nightmarish weird thing has a totally new context when you hit this section and that particular part of it. And then, sorry, and this is going to be long too, but I think is really, really, really crucial to like the way that you start to treat all of his this whole book. This is a bit long, but this is the end of the section that we're talking about today. Because I forgot to frame this at the beginning, we're talking about two parts today. 9 Class A, which goes from page 200 to 10? 206?
It's only like 5 pages long.
Yeah, 204. And then the beginning of the 10th composition book from page 205 to 238. So in the end of this part, on page 237 and 238, there's this long bit. I'm going to write the first book ever with the intriguing title, How I Became a Mental and Physical Invalid Without Also Becoming a Jerk. By the bestseller by Tómas Jónsson, a book about a jerk that is being translated into 7 foreign languages. The author describes with sensitive self-understanding and openness and unprudishness his mental suffering. He is an old, sick, and friendless invalid in a basement apartment of which he has been robbed. He is an invalid with shit on his ass. This gently written book is full of subtle understandings and awareness, full of sympathy for the underdog. The book is a warning to all of us who are not yet confined to bed. This is a book for the entire family, good for learning about life and the fate of children. A bold book. It will awaken many questions in its reader that will remain unanswered by the author. Each must answer for himself. Is Tómas actually really disabled? Was he stripped of his apartment through trickery? Is he a Dadaist? Did he rape a 10-year-old girl down in the laundry room? There we go. Is he perhaps a homosexual? Is he a murderer? Who is Tómas? Is he all of us? Is he a symbol of the modern Icelandic nation, mentally and physically disabled and ill-fitted with military clothes from the American base? About these and other questions, you will break your brain reading our must-have Christmas book of this year, How He Became a Mental and Physical Invalid Without Also Becoming a Jerk. Read the book about the man who wrote about his genitalia the way people once wrote of warts, as a small but lively wart below his belly, and wrote to heads of state, Tómas Jónsson, bestseller, our Christmas book this year. Which
I wonder if we can get you just reading that just like that on Spotify as one of their paid ads.
Yeah, totally. That's such a great blurb for the book, and really just kind of encapsulates the whole book right there.
I know. I'm not even for this week's post that I write. I'm just doing that. There's nothing else. Just that. I'll do a video recording of it. But that. I mean, it makes this book that really got to like the heart of what we talked about last week, and I've been talking about too. Of like, he's writing this book, and like, how do you interpret it? And even says like the questions that you're going to break your brain on, like, who is Tómas? Did he rape this girl in the laundry room? Is he a murderer? Is he these things? Is he this? And like constantly giving you one little bit of information and then something that basically contradicts it and makes it have like this great ironic distance.
Yeah, and I love that little line there, is he a Dadaist as well? Because a bit earlier in the chapter, there's a point, let me see if I can find it, but he talks about drawing mustaches on pictures of women or something like that, which is, of course, Duchamp and Dadaism right there. And
that's where this book just keeps giving, in the sense that there are so many little things that you could chase up, and that there are these... there's references where he's calling his penis Bowie, and like there's another moment where he uses the word bossy as well, and these references to these lesser known later medieval Icelandic erotic sagas, and it's one of those things where part of you wants to sort of find the equivalent in English, whether it's the sort of, the poetry of the Earl of Rochester or something. Part of you just wants to leave those as gold mines for a reader to find. And if people go down a rabbit hole of reading erotic Icelandic sagas as a result of this podcast, then so be it.
So that brings up two questions. So Bowie is one of the erotic Icelandic saga references.
He's linking the two. So like he's I think it's one of these moments where he's sort of playing on, because the really it's Bosi is the direct reference, where Bowie's actually an Icelandic name nowadays. Although one thing I discovered when I was translating it is that the earliest documented usage of Bowie as a Icelandic name was in accepted Icelandic name, because Icelanders have to have their names approved, was in 2016.
Whoa!
It comes from the name of a Nordic giant, Baugi. So there is a pun that you can't get on the fact that he's calling his prick by the name of a giant, right?
Right.
And there's no way to translate. I mean, you could do Bowie the giant, but then it's a bit leaden.
Right.
But the other weird thing is, somebody out there is calling, probably who hasn't read Tómas Jónsson, has called their son the modern form of it, Bowie, which is unfortunate when that poor boy comes to read Tómas Jónsson in years to come.
oh my
He's going to be
God.
traumatized.
Wow. So what are the erotic Icelandic sagas?
I guess maybe it's a too strong a word to say erotic, but there's this later set of so you've got sort of the classic Icelandic sagas, things like Njal's saga, and where there's these heroic deeds and these questions of morality and what it means to be a true Viking. And then later on you get these lesser read and maybe derivative sagas, which are more concerned with like sexual escapades. And there's, I think medieval literature is full of these, like Chaucer himself is full of these great dirty jokes about people sleeping with the wrong person because they've climbed into the wrong bed and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
And that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. But again, he's just packing in. There's a reference to Duchamp that's buried here. There's a reference to this like somewhat obscure medieval literature that's buried here, and you get the sense that Tómas is being presented as a character who knows a ton of stuff.
Right. He has been referenced as being like the learned, like a sort of minor scholar at various points in time. Even writes those like Icelandic Association studies essays and things like that. So
there's this interesting question while we're on there as well, and it comes up in this section as well. Like he's this interesting figure who's like the amateur expert. Yeah. And when we get to the 10th composition book, it's very concerned with the idea of like who the state supports with its money and what happens to that, and you're never quite sure at times whether we're meant to be like, oh, this is a good idea, the state should stop providing for the needy, or this is completely ironic and this is a horrible idea. But again, it's interesting to be reading this book at this moment where, during the whole Brexit thing, the British politician Michael Gove was like, we shouldn't trust experts. And Tómas Jónsson's kind of the warning figure there, right? And you're like, you want to have people think that one through a bit.
That's true. And that is like, the we don't trust experts thing leads to a lot of problems in life generally. I don't know if anyone pays attention to any part of the news, but no matter when this goes live, that statement will be true.
Well, next time my car breaks down, I am definitely just going to go and find some random person on the street and have them fix it, because I don't trust experts.
Exactly. Right. So backing up for a second, I know, David, you had some questions about specific translation things, but before we get into that, I have the question of this 9 Class A. First of all, I don't know what that is as a section. Like, why is it Class A? Is this like I don't know what that's a reference to. And then the fuck do you make out of this section? This section's crazy to me. Like I read it and it's just like, this is like a fever dream of poetry, and like time goes backwards, even though he says that it's like, he implies it in a way that it's going forwards, even though it's going in reverse in the sections at the end. And the poems, I don't know what to make out of. And he's got these little interludes where he essentially keeps honing in on this sort of darkness and referring to Disa again and like writing these poems for Disa. But I didn't know what to do with this section at all.
It's probably one of the most difficult sections in the book, I think. but there's a lot going on here for sure. Like at the beginning, he has this little poem where he talks about the various kinds of fear that form the primitive under the heaven's dome with water and man's flesh, the innate execution of your actions and gestures to the creator, and talking about the various kinds of fear there. To me, it kind of recalled, I don't know how far off the mark I am, but I thought of like Finnegan's Wake and the whole idea of thunder striking fear into man and that kind of starting the whole cycle there. So
that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
This is one of the moments where you really feel like, I mean, it's literally composed of these fragments, right? And excerpts from poetry he's written, and it jumps about in time. So there's a lecture he's apparently given or written the notes for in 57, and then there's a note he's written in 54, and it does have this quality of it's like between sleep and waking to it. It might help. I mean, the class A, the Icelandic word that I'm translating there literally means is used to refer to like what grade in school you're at.
Okay,
but it can also have the association of sort of like rank or quality, right? So for a long time, I was going back and forward between class, as in a school class, or one's class, and the sort of social politics of the book, but also grade, right? And but then does that sort of seem it's like he's grading himself or something, giving himself an A grade, which isn't there in the Icelandic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also a moment that's caught between America, Britain, and Iceland, which is interesting because Iceland is itself, geologically it's caught between Britain and Iceland, but culturally it's caught between Britain and America. So I also think there's this really interesting tagline for the 2-month review here on page 202: "Do not read so fast, we hardly have a chance to gloss."
Yeah, I marked that too.
Kind of what we're doing here, but it's also the sense that like you've got these moments like poetry is so important to Iceland as a literary nation, and so he's trying his hand at poetry as a way to do this stuff, but he's super critical of it. He's got that line, Disa poem, which could also have been written about Miss Gerther, Lou, or other women from the author's timeline. And like, so all of these women are just interchangeable to you. You're absolutely aware of that fact. And, so that I think it's partly that, that move to sort of destabilize the romantic idea of writing poetry to women, I think is going on.
That's interesting.
There's also, I think, a little bit of like a parallel with King Lear there, I think, where King Lear is talking about women's bodies, and he says, "There's hell, there's darkness." And then here we have the poem, "Namely hell, neither have I seen your sagging breasts, nor under the clothes that shelter flesh."
Yeah. I love that being there. And actually, David, you pointed out in another reference, there's also sort of a rewriting of Whitman at one point in this book. So I think there are ways, the project is partly these sort of rewriting of classic works of literature too.
Yeah, even though he might not totally directly reference them sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very true. It also has that bit of like the deserted rock on the next part. Like I saw deserted rock through my binoculars, that the deserted rock was me. And that reminded me of like Iceland as the nation too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That's an interesting section. So yes, I would agree that of the parts that we read, like the last week's ones were a bit challenging because they had a lot of voices that kind of cut in and out, and some things that were that in that moment were rather disturbing. And this one's is complicated because it is the poems, all these fragments of poems, sort of up against each other, and thematically has a lot of fear, forgetfulness, anxiety, and being alone, but like doesn't explain it in like a straightforward way. Then the 10th composition book actually seems to be much more back to like a not linear narrative, but like a couple of there's at least in this part that we read 2 very long sections that are more or less like stories that he's telling. One about Katrine's mom and dad who come to stay with her, and the dad dies. The mom's like, nope, don't believe it. Can't possibly be dad. You didn't test it close enough, and going through that whole process of like accepting death. But then the one that we maybe want to talk about too is the Black Sheep, the folktale about how Iceland was like, yeah, America, you can have a army base here on our island as long as you don't let any black people come here, because the second that there's one black person on this island, everyone's going to hate them because they're going to have like racist shit come up because of that. So we're just going to solve the racist problem by not having any black people.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
What do you make of it, David, as a reader?
That's a really difficult section to deal with. I mean, there's a whole lot of uncomfortable shit there, definitely. A bit earlier in the book, I noticed a section which might have a bit of a parallel. It was on page 138 to 39, where they have these coal farmers coming or coal miners, that is, coal miners that have got soot on their faces, and it says they're half black. The half-black started to sing tunelessly, stick out his tongue, dance his feet on the waxed floor, and get tears of joy in his eyes, which sounds a lot kind of like a minstrel show, like an American minstrel show. So it seems to be kind of a theme that comes up a lot in the book, is like American racial issues. I don't know, like a minstrel show, I mean, there's a lot. Like a minstrel show, of course, is like the idea that you're taking pleasure in the suffering of, in this case, black slaves. And that's, of course, it's sort of like the Abu Ghraib photos in a way, right? And that's like a huge issue in itself, of course. But I think in the book, it speaks more generally to this kind of terrifying anxiety element that you have in Tómas Jónsson's mind. Like it kind of actualizes that in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and to give some sort of historical context for this, so I mean, there is an academic article from the Journal of Cold War Studies. If anyone wants to chase it up, it's volume 6, number 4, in fall 2004. But it was written by an academic called Valur Ingemundarson, and it does claim that that there was a secret ban imposed by the Icelandic government on the stationing of black U.S. troops in Iceland. As I was translating this section, I was then doing some research, and there's a blog discussion on Snopes, which was, people who, obviously this is the anonymity of the internet, but people who are saying, no, I was stationed there at the time and that's absolute rubbish. Or, my father was stationed there and he never mentioned it. So, it's difficult to know whether, you've got this academic versus people who claim to have been on the ground, and I don't know the exact story. What's interesting is that it ends up in the book being used as a criticism of America more, in the lines that sort of Dave is talking about, more than as a criticism of Iceland. And I think there's a sense in which another project of this book is to not let Iceland be the romantic hero, but also it still, feels like it's wrestling with a sense that maybe it's superior to other nations, but maybe for the wrong reasons.
Right.
It's interesting. That is a pretty wild section to read and digest, but it does tie back into the American base, which we had talked about a little bit before, the historical context for having that there.
Well, and I think also this whole anxiety. So, we talked a bit last week about the attitude that Tómas Jónsson has to children. And so, in this section, you've got the fact that, you've got this horrible infanticide that goes on, and it's partly to do with this pseudoscience of whether open windows might change the color of the skin of a child, or whether, something the mother might have done might, affect skin color, which was a medieval pseudoscientific belief at one stage. And I think the book is continually concerned with, and Tómas's mind is continually concerned with, what happens when you have offspring and what that leads to. And if somebody wants to read it in psychological ways, I think that's a rich vein to explore, a disturbing one though.
Oh yeah. And there's a lot here about in that story he describes the umbilical cord severed, and it swung to and fro around the pail like a jet from a powerful water hose. There's a lot in this, which is great. Of course,
shouldn't be funny, but it is.
I know.
Especially after we've got the sort of, we've already been talking about him whipping around and he's still pissing everywhere, right? And that kind of spray. There's a whole lot that gets meshed together here. Yeah.
And there's so much in here too about telephones and calling people on the phone. And of course there's an umbilical cord, telephone cord. Parallel there, where you give the kid the phone, as he says at one point, and the kid forgets to stream. So there's that kind of thing going on.
That's interesting. So Yeah. Well, which you had some specific questions about translation issues, right?
Yeah, particularly in the section 9. I think one of my favorite passages here is on page 203. It says, finally, we shall look into what we are, a various group of names chosen by our neighbors. Who knows whether the body corresponds to its name? You, Tómas Jónsson, walked from the front door of the house early in the morning and returned in the evening, christened with another name. Tómas, too much. And Tómas there has 2 M's, actually. And that's kind of a returning thing throughout the book, is this extra M in the name. And you were telling me, Lytton, that he's actually playing on 2 different Icelandic words there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I know this causes headaches for like trying to proofread the book, where it seems like the translator has screwed up and
you don't know when it's a typo.
Right. But so the Icelandic word tome, with T, the O with the accent, and M, it's a vacuum or an emptiness, and mas, which can mean chit-chat or chatter. And you can't get the same pun exactly, but, he's this paradox, right? On the one hand, he's completely empty, and on the other hand, he's just always talking and chatting. And so I was trying to play with the ideas of too much, or occasionally hoping some readers might get the Hispanic mas, coming in there, because Bergson translates from Spanish, but also, American readers are going to have different cultural touchstones than Icelandic readers. And that's totally fine, right? If you get something out of the language of this book that's different from what the author was putting into it, that's part of the project of translation. And I think this book particularly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then on the top of page 202, I see you translated it as, you write, an empty mess, Tómas Jónsson, Tomess, which is great.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the times when, you do translation is a creative activity, and there are moments when you do get to have a little bit of fun with it and say, as long as you're respecting the book and doing something that's within the terms of what the book is doing, you can invent a little bit that way, and it's not exactly what happens in the Icelandic, but hopefully it's exactly in the spirit of the Icelandic.
Yeah.
And you do a great job with that in this whole book. I mean, this is still, we mention every week, but it is just a masterpiece of translation
I agree,
to make this all work, and to hit all these different notes and have all this different stuff going on. God. I mean, it breaks your mind trying to, like that little bit from the beginning, like you're breaking your mind on trying to understand this book, but breaking your mind on trying to understand how to translate it. It's like a whole nother level of mind breaking that you got.
Yeah, well, it's funny because there is there's a quote I remember from years ago when I first read Ulysses, where at one point Joyce apparently said something like, I've succeeded in writing a book that's going to keep people talking about it and the critics talking about it for so long that you can't ever forget about it because it's basically so weird and difficult. And that was definitely in my mind as I was translating this book, because you can keep talking about it forever in really fun ways.
Yeah,
absolutely. And this is a good section. I think this is a fun section too. Like we've had, there's a challenge of that section 9, but that's even interesting, and it's brief enough that you don't feel like overwhelmed by like, oh, I'm not quite sure what to do with all this poetry, but it's also pretty interesting. And then this part has like those 2 stories, has like also like his little story of like his family, or I guess like of himself and his relation to the world. Once again, where Tómas is like, I wish I could be like one of these popular, like good people, but like no one likes me. And like I'm so alone.
He seems so like the rest of us then to me. Like he's just got normal social anxieties. He's like the rest of us. And then in other parts of the book, he's like, I'm going to speak through the radio and tell Svein and Katrine to get the hell out of my house.
And this great. And this this 10th composition book has a lot of that. Like, I'm going to get them the hell out. Like, I need to just tell them we're breaking up. You're out. No more. Shouldn't have to deal with this.
Well, and that's where it's making these really interesting parallels, right? There's no coincidence that this is the book where he's thinking about the Iceland trying to exclude on an ethnic basis, right, in whatever way it can. And then, Tómas is trying to exclude in a different set of rules, but, he's trying to exclude people from his apartment. And I've been thinking a lot, especially when I was translating it, what makes it feel, in some sense, it's like quite an American book. I mean, it's distinctly Icelandic, but it feels like it fits with American readers. And I think one of the things is that in this section where he comes between the two stories on page 222, where he says, "Have I moreover been, yes, deprived them of their automatic right to lie undisturbed, yes, in my mansion, or is my sanctuary become a cash cow? No." And he's really basically thinking about the right to property. Mm-hmm. And do you have a right to own your own home? And and that, I think, is something that's obviously occupied a lot of Western thought and a lot of American thought over the last 50 years.
Yeah. I wonder if we could talk a bit about Lytton. I was showing that video of Bergson talking at a literary festival that I found on the internet. Yeah, there's this video of Bergson talking in English at this literary festival in Reykjavik in 1987. The likes of Kurt Vonnegut are there, Rob Grillet, Isabel Allende, and I'm sorry.
Just whoa! That's a quite a lineup, and quite a diverse lineup.
Oh yeah. Just authors and people from all over the world are there, and Bergson takes the microphone and tells them in English to get the hell out of the country. Basically, he says that you people come here and you speak in all these different foreign tongues. You speak in Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, English, and we Icelanders pretty much just sit here and nod politely, even though we don't understand shit. And we're tired of it, so get the hell out of here, basically. And as you were saying to me, I think, Lytton, you kind of wonder, like, how serious is he when he says things like that, both in the book and in that speech at the festival? It's like, what's going on here exactly?
Right, he does say, he actually, interestingly, before he starts his remarks in English, he says a ton of stuff in Icelandic that the audience are cracking up at. And it's precisely, the English language people can't understand what he's saying, and some of it is sort of like I'm now going to have to speak in English to to these people and stuff like that. And there's this really interesting moment where he's, there's a sense of, you normally associate that get the hell out, you're speaking the wrong language, with a kind of nationalist, narrow-minded worldview in which there's no time for difference or diversity. And yet Bergson is also, he's the guy who's translated Garcia Marquez into Icelandic. He's the guy who's translated Don Quixote not once but twice. And so there's this sense of like, he's occupying this weird position at that moment where he's wanting to sort of wonder why it is that Icelandic keeps coming second to English and Norwegian and Swedish, even within Iceland. And he's sort of taking Icelanders to task for being not confident enough about their own language, while at the same time he's also having a dig at Icelanders, basically being like, we're too dumb to get this. And so, it's not quite Little Island mentality, but it fits all too easily into that mentality of Little Islands. So he's not immune to those kind of comments, and it's very clear when you're looking at the moderator of the panel on that video clip, which we'll have to get up on the 3% website.
Absolutely.
You can see the moderator being like, "Oh, geez, who stuck me with this?" Like, and he knows it's coming, and then he's got to not offend Goodberger, but he's got to not offend all these other prestigious people.
Oh my god, I want to see this now. I didn't know about this video.
It'll crack you up.
Oh, but sounds kind of spectacular. And you mentioned, too, he has other videos online as well, right, Lytton?
There's a couple, yeah. I mean, I think that's probably the best of them.
Okay.
And it's also kind of interesting because he's raising the problem of tourism, in this case, literary tourism, but of people coming to Iceland and not getting it and imposing on it. And that, that's, 30 years ago. And it's a discussion that's been really important in Iceland over the last 10 years. So it's not, he's not just being cranky. There is Iceland is trying to work out this question of how to deal with people wanting to come to Iceland, but not necessarily wanting to do things that are in keeping with the way Iceland works. And Tómas Jónsson is a book that's struggling with that.
Right. And that's really interesting. I like that. So I like this whole book because the things like that, things that sort of, that mentality of thought of like approaching the problem as a problem and like continually problematizing it or making things not so cut and dry or not so like, oh, well, that's obviously that's bad. Obviously this is good. And doing so in a way that's like got this very strange viewpoint that's both like broken and contradictory and cranky, but yet enticing. Like that's I like that. That's right in like my wheelhouse of things that make me happy, is like that sort of fuck upness of things where it's not so cut and dry or like, yeah, everyone agrees this way. This is obvious. This is the way to think. So
I'm really glad that's coming across. And I think it's, I'm curious to hear, from David on that point. I think as a translator, you're hoping you're making it readable enough that people can enjoy it as a work, but also comprehensible enough that people can get that what technically is known as fuck upness.
Yeah. I think you did that really well here in this book. I mean, it's pretty fucked up. Yeah, I'll agree with that.
Oh man! So then, what do you guys have favorite sentences from this section? I'm usually trying to. You got to give one.
Right.
Got to give one.
And I feel like I can't do how I became a mental and physical invalid without also becoming a jerk, because that, that's definitely, we've already done that one. But I think just partly because we've talked about it almost every other podcast, but not this podcast, I want to throw out there from page 215, the writing desk is headed into dusk. I can no longer see my writing. And that sense of there's something desperately sad, but also desperately necessary about writing.
Yeah.
And, translating this late into the night and just wondering about not being able to see my own writing. And, that resonated with me.
That's a good one. I like that too. David, do you have a line?
I found that I underlined this sentence on page 216. I am the eternal Tómas with two M's again. I am the eternal Tómas with who Sigurdur and Olaf agree has never lived anywhere other than as a thought fetus. I don't really know what to make of that right off, but you can read this so much and not totally get it and still be fascinated.
That's embarrassing, man.
Yeah.
I read my favorite ones by far already, so I'm just going to go with... oh, God, there's so many good ones, though. Like I do like this one. Okay, I'll just go with this. Alas, the city with all its navel-gazing, boring men, it's most tolerable in a nightmare.
Right.
Pretty solid. It's either between that, or I'll throw out a second one just because whatever. It's tonight I will break up with my lodgers. I will not allow anxiety to torment me anymore.
Yeah.
Isn't this moment of hope there, buddy? Not gonna work.
Talking of the city is only tolerable in a nightmare. Isn't it true that next week's podcast is being sponsored by Iceland Air or the Icelandic Tourist Association or something? Yeah,
exactly. Oh man, no. Sometimes I just ride my bike around Rochester at night and think that same thing. Oh, that was mean. That not necessarily true either. But yeah. So next week we will be covering the rest of the 10th composition book, which is pages 238 through 281, and another Smith will be on this time, Patrick Smith, to talk about that section. But until then, you can always listen to all of these on iTunes. Please give us a rating if you could, and a review. Also, you can follow 3%, where we put weekly posts, sort of also articulating more, getting more into these different sections and giving more quotes and a little bit more framework to trying to approach them. There's also a GoodReads group. If you look for 2-month review, you'll find it there. And you can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Chad W. Post. Lytton, you're at Lytton J. Smith.
That's the one.
And David, you are...
I don't have Twitter.
You don't have Twitter. You're smart. You're one of it's like every other guest doesn't use Twitter.
No, I've managed to avoid it so far, but I am on Facebook, so I have that to waste time with.
How can you? You must have to use a middle initial, because David Smith cannot be the only David Smith, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I'm pretty much ungoogleable, which is good.
Solid, works.
Yeah. You could search for David Smith Norwegian translator, I guess, because I'm pretty sure I'm the only guy named that who is a Norwegian translator. So there's that.
And that's probably true. Are you working on any project right now that you want to plug?
Not at the moment. I am going to be going to the Gothenburg Book Fair in Sweden next month, and so I'll be talking to publishers there and trying to hear about what books they're excited about. So hoping to land something there.
That's great. That'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Have to check in and tell us how it goes. And then you'll be at ALTA, because one thing I didn't mention is that you are one of the ALTA Translation Fellows for this year.
That's right.
So there you go. So until next week, I don't have anything else to add, but keep reading the book, and we will talk to you then.